The Audie Murphy mystery has finally cracked open, and the truth is far darker than anyone ever imagined. When a small private plane went down in the fog-wrapped mountains of Virginia on May 28, 1971, the world was told to mourn a tragedy and move on. A tragic accident, they said, bad visibility, pilot error, just another plane lost in the Appalachians. But that explanation never sat right, not for a man like Audie Murphy, the baby-faced warrior who held off an entire German company alone, who personally ended over 240 enemy soldiers, who wore every combat medal America could possibly give, a man who walked through fire in the most brutal chapters of World War II only to die quietly in the hills of Virginia at 45. Now, new evidence suggests the crash was no accident at all, that the most decorated hero in U.S. history may have been silenced by the very government he fought to protect. Former military intelligence officer Colonel James Stevenson put it plainly, what happened to Audie Murphy wasn't tragedy, it was betrayal. But to understand why the government may have wanted Murphy gone, you have to understand where he came from. Born in 1925 in the dirt-poor farmlands of Hunt County, Texas, seventh of 12 children, he didn't grow up. He survived. He hunted to keep his brothers and sisters alive. He worked cotton fields at age 10 for pennies. His father abandoned the family. His mother died when he was 16. And the weight of everything fell on his tiny frame. He knew suffering before he knew childhood. It forged him. When Pearl Harbor hit, Audie tried to enlist in the Marines, the Navy, the paratroopers. Everyone rejected him. Too small, too light, too fragile, but they didn't know the fire in him. He faked his age and forced his way into the army. And once he hit the battlefield, the world learned what survival creates. Sicily, Italy, France, Germany, 9 brutal campaigns, wounds, frostbite, blood loss, exhaustion. He rose from private to lieutenant, right there in the mud and fire. 33 medals, 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, a Medal of Honor for the day he stood alone on a burning tank destroyer, bullets tearing past him, calling artillery fire almost on top of himself while refusing to retreat. What made Murphy different wasn't just courage, it was the ability to stay absolutely calm while surrounded by death. A stillness that was terrifying. A stillness learned from years of hunger, brutality, loss. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch. He just fought. When the war ended, America turned him into a movie star, a symbol, a poster boy. But behind the cameras, behind the applause, the war never ended for Audie Murphy. PTSD wasn't even a word back then. They called it nerves. He called it nightmares. Gunshots in his sleep. Sweat-soaked sheets. Loaded pistols beside his bed. He tried to speak out about what war really does to a man, the psychological damage, the government neglect, the veterans discarded like broken equipment. And that is where the story darkens. Because Murphy didn't just talk, he investigated. He began asking questions about government medical testing on soldiers, about missing VA funds, about classified combat reports that didn't match official records. He was preparing to go public. He was becoming a whistleblower. And just weeks later, his plane went down. No distress call, no mechanical explanation, no survivors. Case closed. Immediately, too quickly, too quietly. And now, decades later, the truth is surfacing in pieces. Witnesses who were warned to stay silent. Files once sealed now showing deliberate omissions, and a pattern familiar to every historian who studies inconvenient heroes. The men who survive hell often become the men who know too much, and sometimes the nation that raises them as heroes becomes the nation that cannot afford their voice. Audie Murphy didn't just die. He was erased, and now, all these years later, the question remains, who ordered it, and why? His commanding officers would later say that battle did not rattle Audie Murphy, it sharpened him. Where other men froze, shook, or broke under the weight of incoming fire, Murphy became impossibly calm, as if the world slowed for him and him alone. In the chaos of machine gun bursts and mortar blasts, he could see clearly, choose deliberately, act without hesitation. That terrifying stillness is what defined January 26, 1945, near Holtz, France, when his company of 128 men had been reduced to just 19 survivors. The Germans were closing in, an overwhelming force advancing with brutal precision. Murphy, already wounded, ordered his men to fall back while he stayed behind. Then, in a moment that defies human instinct, he climbed onto a burning tank destroyer, flames licking at the metal beneath him, and seized the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on top. Alone, wounded, and exposed, he held an entire German company at bay, killing scores of advancing soldiers, calling artillery strikes dangerously close to his own position, refusing to retreat even as shrapnel tore into his leg. When the smoke cleared, he did not collapse. He led his men in a counterattack. He was 19. When later asked about it, Murphy did not brag. "I was scared and I was fighting," he said, as if describing a fistfight instead of one of the most extraordinary acts of courage in military history. For that, he received the Medal of Honor. By war's end, he held every U.S. combat award possible and 5 foreign honors. Life magazine put his young, boyish face on its cover, celebrating America's unbreakable hero. But surviving the battlefield was easier than surviving the years after. The nation he saved would later betray him, says investigative journalist Michael Thorne. To understand how the war hero became something dangerous to the very system he served, we must follow him into Hollywood, where the spotlight lit his face but only deepened the shadows inside him. James Cagney brought him west. Universal signed him. And suddenly the Texas farm boy, with a 5th-grade education, was starring in more than 40 films. He wasn't just a war novelty, he was good, especially in westerns, where the horses, guns, and silence felt familiar. In 1955, he reenacted his own trauma in To Hell and Back, playing himself as he relived artillery screams, burning metal, and the metallic taste of fear. The film shattered box office records that wouldn't be broken for 20 years. But while the public saw a smiling hero, the Knights told another story. He slept with a loaded pistol. His dreams were full of muzzle flashes and screams. The war never let him go. They called it nerves, not PTSD. He called it hell. Anyone who says they don't dream about the war is lying, he said. His friends knew the truth. Murphy was still fighting, long after the shooting stopped. He didn't just speak about trauma. He fought for those who lived with it. Audie Murphy publicly pushed for the government to acknowledge the invisible wounds of war, insisting that the pain carried home by soldiers was as real as any bullet wound. He was one of the first American public figures to demand medical studies on what would later be known as PTSD, urging Congress to provide care for Korean War veterans suffering from the same terrors he faced nightly. Audie was decades ahead of his time, says Dr. Sullivan. He refused to accept the lie that the mind heals just because the body comes home, but his advocacy came with consequences. Powerful government and military agencies had no interest in discussing the psychological cost of their wars. Acknowledging trauma meant acknowledging guilt, and Murphy was a man who did not back down. His personal life mirrored the internal war raging inside him. His first marriage to actress Wanda Hendricks collapsed under the weight of his nightmares. She later revealed that during a flashback, he once held her at gunpoint without even realizing it. His second wife, Pamela Archer, became his anchor. She built a quiet, contained world around him, shielding him during the worst nights when he woke drenched in fear, convinced he was still under fire. Their life was not without strain, but she gave him something he had never known before: safety. By the late 1960s, Audie Murphy was no longer just a hero. He had become a voice for the broken. He visited VA hospitals, sat at the bedsides of forgotten veterans, and took his message directly to Congress, insisting the government face the human cost of the wars it waged. He was hearing things no one was supposed to hear, says investigative journalist Michael Thorne. Whistleblowers inside the VA, records that didn't match public statements, patterns of neglect, patterns of cover-ups. Meanwhile, Hollywood had moved on. Westerns were fading, new stars were rising, Murphy's investments failed, tax pressures mounted, and soon the hero of America was buried under debts he never should have had. Financial experts later noted the timing was suspicious. His IRS troubles intensified exactly when he became louder about government failures. Then, in late 1970, he began developing a TV series about veterans, not a patriotic drama, but an exposé. And that's when everything shifted. Sources now reveal Murphy discovered documentation suggesting systematic mistreatment and abandonment of thousands of injured veterans, a revelation that would have shattered public trust in the government. By early 1971, Murphy was asking questions that very powerful people did not want answered. And then, on May 28, 1971, he boarded a twin-engine Aero Commander in Virginia. The weather was poor, fog thick enough to choke the sky, but the pilot, Herman Butler, wasn't reckless. He had over 8,000 hours of experience and a reputation for caution. Aviation experts still cannot explain why he took off that morning. Butler knew better, says pilot Richard Collins. 14 minutes later, the plane slammed into Brush Mountain. 6 dead, no survivors, and almost immediately, the FAA declared it pilot error, closed the investigation, and moved on. No deeper inquiry, no reconsideration, just silence. The kind of silence that feels intentional. The official NTSB investigation was shallow, almost intentionally incomplete, a report written to close the case rather than uncover the truth, a neat summary for the public, while avoiding the uncomfortable questions beneath the surface. Former NTSB investigator Paul Martinez later admitted that key forensic procedures that would now be considered standard were simply never performed. Witness statements that contradicted the official timeline were minimized, quietly sidelined, or omitted entirely, as if someone wanted the public to see only one version of events. Aviation experts who reviewed the case noticed the same pattern immediately: too many leads ignored, too many assumptions left unchallenged, too many questions without follow-up. The flight path alone defied logic. Former FAA investigator Thomas Rawlings noted that the pilot, Herman Butler, was flying far below the minimum safe altitude for that mountainous region, despite being a veteran flyer with over 8,000 logged hours. This wasn't a rookie's mistake, it looked deliberate. Even more unsettling was the debris field. Several components of the aircraft appeared to have separated before impact, pieces missing entirely from the crash site that should have been there if the plane merely flew into a mountain. Aviation disaster specialist Rebecca Chen pointed out that critical control surfaces, ones that almost always survive impact in some form, were nowhere to be found. Investigators at the time blamed the terrain and weather, but newer forensic reviews tell a different story. In 2019, metallurgist Dr. Howard Kleen examined photographs of the surviving wreckage and identified stress fractures inconsistent with crash trauma, indicating the aircraft may have suffered structural failure mid-air, not upon impact. And then there was Butler himself, presented to the public as just Murphy's pilot. His personnel records, once classified, tell another story. Documents partially released in 2015 showed missing blocks of employment history and associations with government contracting groups tied to intelligence operations. Reports linked him to Air America, a CIA-operated fleet that conducted clandestine missions throughout Southeast Asia. These are not the credentials of a casual corporate pilot. These are the fingerprints of someone trained to follow orders without question. 3 separate witnesses reported hearing an explosion in the sky before the crash. Their testimonies acknowledged briefly and then dismissed, folded away under the excuse of confusion or poor recall. But one of those witnesses, Harold Simmons, maintained until the end of his life that the sound was distinct, separate, and unmistakable. First the explosion, then a pause, and only then the crash. Pamela Murphy, Audie's widow, never accepted the accident explanation. She always said her husband would never fly under unsafe conditions, and certainly not with a pilot who made reckless decisions. For years, the family lived with questions they had no way to answer. Then in 2018, everything shifted. A major declassification of Vietnam-era intelligence files, combined with newly released pilot record summaries, revealed connections, timelines, and operational overlaps no one had seen before, pieces that suddenly fit together with disturbing clarity. And that's when the real story began to surface. The second turning point came with advancements in forensic imaging and materials analysis, new technology capable of re-examining old crash evidence that had once been considered inconclusive. And the third came from something no one expected: aging witnesses, pilots, VA employees, and military officers, men in their 70s and 80s, no longer afraid of retaliation, finally deciding to speak before their time ran out. What they revealed didn't just challenge the official story, it shattered it. The timeline we've been told for over 50 years was clean, convenient, and comforting. The timeline that has now emerged is chaotic, disturbing, and deeply political. The real breakthrough began not with a dramatic confession, but with a bureaucratic technicality: the mandatory declassification of Cold War surveillance records. Thousands of pages documenting domestic monitoring operations were quietly released, and buried in them, almost like someone hoped they would stay unnoticed, were dozens of files referencing Audie Murphy. Files that had no logical reason to exist. Murphy, a decorated hero, a Hollywood public figure, a man who had given everything to his country, was under active intelligence surveillance from at least 1969 until the day he died. Historian Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, who spent months reviewing the documents, was stunned. The level of monitoring on Murphy was not casual, it was extensive, consistent, and deliberate. Phone calls logged, mail intercepted, informants reporting on his private conversations. He was flagged under COINTELPRO, the same program used to track civil rights leaders, anti-war organizers, and political dissidents. Former FBI agent Samuel Drake didn't mince words when he reviewed the files. This level of surveillance is for people the government fears, not people it respects. So what had Murphy done to become a perceived threat? The answer, tragically, came from Murphy's final professional ambition: not another film, not another public appearance, but a television series, one focused on the struggles of U.S. veterans. During his research, Murphy began receiving letters, testimonies, and whispers from inside VA hospitals, stories of patients heavily medicated without explanation, of strange testing protocols, of veterans who seemed more like experimental subjects than patients. What began as heartbreak shifted into suspicion. That suspicion became investigation, and that investigation uncovered something explosive. Murphy had begun to trace a funding trail from VA hospital budgets to shell organizations and government contractors involved in classified behavioral research that mirrored the exact methods and psychological conditioning associated with the CIA's MK-Ultra program. Documents show that by early 1971, Murphy had compiled names, locations, internal memos, and eyewitness interviews. He had enough proof to ignite congressional hearings and dismantle covert psychological programs that stretched across multiple agencies. And this is the critical point. Murphy wasn't just a celebrity threatening to expose wrongdoing. He was the most decorated soldier in U.S. history. If he spoke, the nation would listen. If he testified, politicians would tremble. And if he went public, no government official could bury the story. His calendar, found among his last belongings, confirmed meetings in June 1971 with investigative reporters at the Washington Post and the New York Times, journalists who, 1 year later, would break the Pentagon Papers and change the country. But Murphy never made it to those meetings. His plane went down just days before the first appointment. And once you know that, the question shifts from accident to motive, from tragedy to silencing, from heroism to betrayal. Adding to the already disturbing timeline, newly surfaced correspondence confirms that in the days before the crash, Murphy had contacted his attorney to begin establishing a legal defense fund designed to protect VA employees who wanted to expose the corruption he had uncovered. He wasn't just gathering evidence. He was preparing to give others the courage to step forward with him. The paperwork to form this foundation was found in his briefcase at the crash site, yet somehow it never appeared in the official list of recovered personal effects. It was quietly erased, as if it had never existed. But the most damning revelations came when modern forensic analysts re-examined the only remaining photographs and structural fragments of the aircraft. Using modern imaging technology, material stress analysis, and microscarring detection unavailable in 1971, investigators discovered something chilling: deliberate tampering. On the aircraft's elevator control system, the mechanism that controls ascent and descent, there were tool markings and fatigue patterns that did not match factory machining, routine maintenance, or wear from flight. Aviation forensic specialist James Michaels stated plainly, these components were intentionally weakened, not enough to be noticed before takeoff, but enough to guarantee failure in turbulence. And turbulence was guaranteed in the Blue Ridge Mountains that day. The sabotage was subtle, catastrophic, and almost impossible to detect after the fact. Then came the testimony that changed everything. In 2020, a former Martinsville airport technician, now near the end of his life, signed a sworn affidavit revealing he saw two unknown men working on Murphy's plane the night before the crash. Men with clearance badges he did not recognize, men who were not part of the airport's maintenance crew. When he mentioned this the following day after news of the crash broke, his supervisor told him, "Forget you saw anything." He obeyed. For 50 years, metallurgical analysis of surviving components showed scoring and partial cuts engineered to fail only under stress, a hallmark of covert aircraft sabotage techniques documented in Cold War intelligence manuals. And then, the most chilling testimony of all. A former intelligence operative in his 90s, speaking under legal protection, confirmed that Murphy had been classified as a containment priority due to his investigation into classified VA research programs tied to behavioral conditioning experiments. He claimed Murphy's death was not an accident, but a sanctioned operation authorized at high levels, though he denied direct involvement. His account aligned perfectly with archived flight records and internal communications, placing known intelligence-linked personnel at the airport in the days leading up to the crash. Former CIA historian Dr. Robert Garrison explained that covert neutralizations of perceived domestic threats were not rare in that era, but the idea that such tactics would be used on America's most decorated soldier was unthinkable. Yet the final piece came from the internal memos discovered in the 2018 declassification release. Documents explicitly outlining how the crash investigation was to be managed, orders to attribute the cause to pilot error, orders to limit the scope of mechanical examination, orders to discredit contradictory witnesses, orders to close the case quickly and quietly. The truth was never meant to surface. The story wasn't meant to be questioned. And the hero who survived every battlefield he faced was never meant to survive the one he walked into at home. One partially redacted memo dated June 3, 1971, just 6 days after the crash, contains the line that changes everything: issue resolved per operation, investigation proceeding as planned with expected conclusions, all assets in place to manage any deviations from narrative. In one sentence, the official story we've been fed for nearly 50 years begins to collapse. Taken alongside the forensic reanalysis, the witness testimonies, the pilot's intelligence background, and the missing documents, a chilling picture forms. Audie Murphy, the man who survived artillery barrages, tank assaults, ambushes, and more than 2 straight years of frontline combat, may have been deliberately killed by the very government he fought to defend. This doesn't just imply government involvement, says investigative journalist Michael Thorne. It strongly suggests a coordinated assassination of America's most decorated soldier because he was preparing to expose classified, unethical experimentation on U.S. veterans. And if that truth doesn't shake your faith in institutions, nothing will. For Murphy's family, these revelations have been both heartbreaking and vindicating. His son, Terry Murphy, has become the driving force behind efforts to reopen the official case. "My father survived situations where death was certain," he said in a recent interview. "We never believed a simple aviation error took him. Now we understand why. He was silenced." Terry has spent years navigating government archives, FOIA requests, sealed records, and bureaucratic stonewalls. Every time we get close to a breakthrough, a document is blacked out, a witness passes away, or evidence suddenly can't be located. But we will not stop. My father never stopped fighting for veterans, and neither will we. His determination has drawn support from veterans organizations across the country: Vietnam veterans, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, advocates for PTSD treatment, all of them seeing Murphy's story as a symbol of something larger. If Audie Murphy, our greatest hero, could be discarded and silenced because he spoke the truth, says Vietnam veteran James Peterson, what chance did any of us have when we came home asking for help? In 2022, a bipartisan coalition of senators requested an independent commission to fully reinvestigate Murphy's death and the programs he may have uncovered. The Department of Defense and the VA acknowledged the request and then did nothing. If this were just rumor, says political analyst Dr. Margaret Chen, the government would have every reason to open the files and clear their name, but they haven't. And silence is a language. The implications are enormous. If Murphy was killed to stop him from exposing human experimentation under the guise of medical treatment, then his death represents not just a personal betrayal, but a betrayal of the very ideals he bled for. It is a cruel irony beyond words, reflects historian William Porter. Murphy risked his life to defeat a regime that treated human beings as disposable instruments. If he was killed because he tried to stop his own government from doing the same, then America did to him what the Nazis never could. And that truth, if fully revealed, would force the nation to confront a darkness it still refuses to acknowledge. Historians are now forced to re-examine Audie Murphy's story through an entirely different lens. Once celebrated simply as the baby-faced war hero who made a smooth transition into Hollywood, Murphy is now being understood as something far more profound. Perhaps a man whose unrelenting loyalty to the soldiers he fought beside ultimately cost him his life. Murphy never stopped fighting, explains historian Dr. Elena Rodriguez. The battlefield just changed. Instead of facing German machine guns, he was now confronting bureaucracy, corruption, and hidden networks inside his own government. In this light, his death feels less like a tragic accident and more like a final act of war. His openness about his psychological wounds, what we now call PTSD, was not merely vulnerability, but prophecy. His trauma wasn't just personal pain, but the source of his fierce empathy, the driving force behind his refusal to stay silent while other veterans were being abused and discarded. Psychologist Dr. Matthew Sullivan explains, Murphy understood the desperation of traumatized veterans because he lived it. That made him uniquely able to recognize when they were being exploited. To the powerful institutions that needed silence to maintain their narrative of heroism without consequences, that honesty was dangerous. Veterans advocate Sarah Martinez puts it bluntly. By admitting he was haunted by the war, Murphy shattered the myth of the invincible soldier. He threatened a system built on denial. And so, the tragedy deepens. The boy from the cotton fields, the soldier who fought through hell for his country, the actor who brought dignity to his pain, may have been betrayed by the very nation that pinned medals to his chest. His son, Terry Murphy, continues to push for truth, armed not with rifles, but with documents, declassified files, and testimony wrestled from the shadows. My father survived every bullet the enemy fired at him, Terry says. What killed him was silence, secrecy, and fear. Veterans groups now rally behind Terry not out of conspiracy but recognition. If Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier in American history, could be silenced, then every veteran is vulnerable. In 2022, senators called for a full independent investigation. The request was acknowledged, but still sits unanswered, blocked by the same bureaucratic fog that has hidden the truth for 5 decades. If the story was false, says political analyst Dr. Margaret Chen, the government could clear it up with transparency. The fact that it refuses to is telling. This isn't just the story of a hero's death, it is the story of a government's darkest mirror. Military historian William Porter states, Murphy fought fascism abroad, only to be targeted by authoritarian secrecy at home. The betrayal is almost unspeakable. And yet, the truth continues to surface. Documents are still being declassified. Witnesses on deathbeds are still confessing. The silence is breaking piece by piece for the farm boy who became a legend, for the soldier who refused to abandon his men, for the actor who showed his scars instead of hiding them. The final battle is being won not with bullets, but with truth. And the greatest honor we can give him now is the courage to face what he uncovered and ensure that it never happens again.